Good evening. Good to be here with everyone. Let's take a look and just go ahead and get back into where we were. What we have been talking about, if you haven't been with us, is fear. Not the fear that we have of God, of His reverence, of His awesome power, but the fear that we have in our lives that sometimes holds us back from life. That sometimes, if we use it properly, though, it possibly would and will motivate us to work forward, to continue on. So let's take a look here where we left off last week. We had been looking at some of the words. We had just got into the New Testament as we were running out of time. And we started to talk about this word, we started looking at the word phobia. And obviously, I think we can figure out what the English word is that we use in that. Phobia, fear of something, in the sense of arachnophobia or any other way that you would put that. Now, some examples as we look at. Now, we want to take a look at, just as we have when we were looking through the Old Testament, Matthew 14, verse 30. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." I believe we referenced this passage last week as we were coming to a close. And looking at this, why was Peter afraid? Thought he was going to sink. Now, another question, why did he ask to come out there? Yeah, wanted to prove his faith, maybe? Yeah, sure, but what Peter did was unnatural. Walking on the water, whether you believe in Jesus or not, if you're walking across the water, you're going to be looking at that and say, this is amazing. This is not normal. And we talked about the talents as well, Matthew 25, verse 25. What happened there in that scenario, that one talent man, out of fear, didn't use what was given to him. And he hid it away, and no benefit came from that. John 9, verse 22, and when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples. But they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple. Now, come on. Why would you be afraid of Paul, right, or Saul? Well, what was he doing? Putting people in prison. He was at the stoning of Stephen. The cloaks were placed for him to hold while I guess you can't throw stones at someone when your cloak's on. You got to take that off and get comfortable, But he was there to hold the cloaks at that time. But why they were afraid of him, and it made sense, right? Who would not be thinking, is he a double agent? I mean, this is a guy that's been chasing after the church for a long period of time. He went and got letters saying that he could go out and be basically kind of like, what's that police agency over there in Europe, Interpol? Where they go, they cover everything, it's like an international, so we see that, Paul had that privilege, had that ability to do that, so the fear was warranted, at least. I mean, it would be kind of crazy to walk up to someone that you knew was aggressive towards something you believed in and just out of hope, well, I'll just go up and see how they're doing. No, you would probably avoid that person. Well, they didn't understand what was happening. And really what it comes down to, number one, Saul really wasn't a bad person. Wait a minute, he was throwing people in prison and beating people. But why was he doing that? Yeah, he thought that Christianity was blaspheming God. I mean, so Not to say that he was right. He was wrong at what he was doing, or he wouldn't have changed. But we have this man that literally was doing this because he thought he was doing it for God. Now, it doesn't take away wrong. I mean, you think about all the crusaders in the Dark Ages that went over to Jerusalem and killed people, fought with people. And they said, we do this in the name of God. You'll watch some shows and when they portray those time periods and stuff, you'll sometimes see Christians that see heathen people as nothing more than a lower group of people, and since they aren't Christians, they could do whatever they want to them. Now, obviously, that's not Christianity, but there was, I'm sure, at times mentalities like that. I'm sure today there are mentalities like that. But here we see this fear that we have. Now, another passage here, Acts 18, verse 9. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. So here, even Paul, and doesn't Paul kind of seem like a fearless man? I mean, think about it. I mean, I know he wasn't, but if you think of a tough person, the way that we think of people being tough and men being manly in that sense, you get stoned and you walk back into the village the next day to preach the gospel, he seems fearless, doesn't he? And I don't think it was so much fearless. I'm sure there was apprehension. Paul didn't know what was going to happen. I think Paul had a pretty good idea that it wasn't his time yet, though. I don't know if, I'm not saying that Paul had a deadline and said, okay, here's my date, this is how long my contract is with God. But obviously, in his latter time, he wrote, my time is up. He knew he was going to be put to death. He knew that was happening. So, was it that? He knew that he could live on, that he was going to continue to live on. Not that I'm sitting here thinking he thought he was Superman or something and thought he was bulletproof. But it was the idea that I'm saying his fear, because you're going to have that. Think about that. You get stoned, and we're not talking pebbles. Have you ever had someone tell you about a stoning and how it's done? They use rocks. I mean, some of them may even be considered mini boulders. I mean, this is not a sticks and stone operation that little kids would be doing. This is seriousness. So, for me to think that Paul had no apprehension of getting up and walking back into that city, I would think that Paul wasn't human. Because remember, there is nothing wrong with fear. If fear does not drive us to run away from what we should be doing, and fear, it pushes us. Think about it. Maybe you have the fear of God and the fear of the city, and Paul said, well, God's fear cancels out the people. I'm going to go ahead and do what he wants me to do. So there's nothing wrong with fear. I think fear is an emotion that matter of fact, I think if someone stood up today and said, I don't fear anything, I would look you in your eyes and call you a liar. Because everybody has a fear. It's just there's a difference. Does my fear petrify me to the point where I don't move and I won't react? Or does my fear push me into doing what is right? Galatians chapter 2, verse 12. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were circumcised. This never happens today, right? We don't ever let the crowd decide how we're going to think. I know, I can see everyone's in agreement, so we don't ever do that. None of us here have ever did the wrong thing because the crowd was doing it, and we were kind of pressured to make that decision. This kind of thing happens all the time. So here's James, right? James is Jewish, right? He's an Israelite. He became a Christian. Gentiles have become Christians as well. And when, we'll just say, well, you know what? I'll hit on something from our own history, something heinous and horrible that separated people. Before my time, But I know my dad had told me he remembered things about this, and some of you would remember this, especially in the South. The separations of white and black. Separation, water fountains, restaurants. And the reason I'm saying that is, imagine you go into a restaurant and you sit down with some African American guys and you have a meal with them and you're talking to them, you're having a good time, and then all of a sudden the other guys from town come walking in. I gotta go. And you get up and you leave the table. That's what he's doing. He's when he's comfortable, when he feels it's okay. So he's being a hypocrite, really. When no one else is around, I'll be nice to these people. Now, I'm not saying James was then getting up and picking on them and calling them names or anything, but he was now avoiding them. He was doing what, unfortunately, the Jews have trained themselves to do for a long time. Do you know there is a wall in the temple? Well, there was. The temple's not there anymore. But there was a wall of separation in the temple. Gentiles did not cross that. We're not talking about the Holy of Holies the Holy of Holies in the middle section there. I can't remember the terms lost. What's that? Yes, the holy place and the holy. Yeah, one holy, two holies. Yeah, that's right. We're not talking about that where the high priest was. We're talking about a section of the temple where if you're a Gentile proselyte, you can hang out here. And really, even the Jews could be over there. But if you're a Jew or you're a Gentile, you don't come to this other side. So this has been kind of pushed into their minds a little bit. And they, just as we do today, but they take things the wrong way or too far. They separate things where things shouldn't be separated. Mike, did you have a comment? Yeah, an outdoorsy kind of man is kind of what you would picture. You would think of someone who's working on a boat all their lives, someone who's, strong because they've probably been doing physical things all their lives. I mean, we're not talking about a fishing pole either. You're talking about pulling nets up, probably with pulleys that whatnot. But yeah, absolutely. Peter of all, Peter was the one who Jesus walked up. Well, he wasn't the only one, but he walked up to him. He says, "Come feed. I'll make you fishers of men." And what did Peter do? Yeah, he didn't even hesitate. He jumped off that boat, walked away from his livelihood. But then here we have him. He's in a different group of people. Maybe it would have been a little bit harder with Peter if he was with some people that he didn't know or didn't trust. And maybe he would have, because what I'm trying to get at, first of all, is fear we can learn to deal with the fears in our lives. Did Peter learn to deal with the fear of people? He brought up his denial 3 times, right? He was told he was going to do it. I'll never do that. But did Peter get over that fear? After that point? That's what I mean. After he did the denial and he came back to Jesus, secular history says, and I maybe it is true, it definitely seems like it could be, where they were going to crucify him to put him to death, and he said, "Hang me upside down." He goes, "Because I don't deserve to go out the way he did." I don't know about you, I don't want to go out crucified upside down or upside right. But what I'm trying to say is, one day we can be afraid of something. We've talked about that. We talked in the very beginning of this fear and talking about this, of the fear of little children sometimes. Seeing a shadow on the wall in their bedroom when the lights are off. And being so afraid. I can remember even times as a kid where I saw something on the wall in the dark and the lights came on. I realized what it was, but the lights went back out and I could see it again. And it still kind of scared me a little bit, even though I should have known what it was. That's how crazy fear can control us. Here you have, and that's the mind of a young child, of course. Hopefully as adults we get past some of these things, but there's still things as adults that we will not admit that we're afraid of them. And if we won't admit of our fears, we will never, ever get past them. If we deny we have them, and we'll get into some more of that, how to deal with the fear towards the end of the lesson here. Possibly we might get to tonight. I don't know. We'll see. Another Strong's word, and this one is similar to the last one, but this one's phobos. This one's used 47 times, which it means fear, dread, terror. In some of the examples here that we see for John, just John 7:13. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now that's just a short little snippet, and without knowing the rest of what was happening there, you might already know that, but without knowing what is happening, we might not know the context here. So here it is, Jesus being recognized by people, and many of them realized he was the Messiah, that he was the Jesus, the Christ that was called for, but because of the majority of the crowd, many were not willing to stand up and say they believed in him. Can you imagine that? We have trouble, and I know God is with me everywhere I go, and he sees what I'm doing, but we have trouble when Jesus isn't physically standing beside us. And here were individuals that had him right in plain sight, and fear made them be afraid to admit they believed in him. That's the worst fear I think anyone could have in this world. The fear to be a Christian because you're afraid of the backlash from others. That's, I think, the worst thing. And don't get me wrong, there's other fears that are horrible. And there may be some bugs or some insects that you're so afraid of that you'll run out of the house. But I think the biggest fear is that of God. Jamel? Yeah, true. Yeah, absolutely. Fear can go either direction. I mean, fear can work for a positive and fear can work for a negative. Absolutely true. Anyone else? All right. 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 5. Indeed, when we come to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. All right. So, it almost sounds as if Paul was saying every step they took in Macedonia was a tough one, was a scary one. You know, here inside, he's with the church. He's with them. And while he's there, there's fears. And everything on the outside, there's conflicts. Does that sound like life sometimes? You know, sometimes we feel like we're stuck in the house and everything's happening around us and all these things, and we can look around and we can see conflict all over the world. And then fears that we decide whether or not we're going to let them hold us back, or whether or not we're going to let those fears push us in the right direction. Yeah, Cindy, go ahead. Well, to me also, the problem is not so much the ones that are afraid to come out to church, but the ones that are afraid to come out to church would have opened everything else up in their lives. And yet they still use that excuse, I'm afraid. But yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes in some situations, fear is something that is mocked or put down. And in other times, everyone else is so afraid too. They're not going to make fun of you for your fear, and it just, So yeah, I think that you do. You become complacent, and you say, well, I'm just not going because of this. And that's where you hope, and we pray, and we hope that they're not making the wrong decisions. And continuing with that thought anyways. All right. Yeah, I think the whole COVID thing is a great subject to talk about with the fear. Because it caused so much fear, and there's still fear from it. I mean, really, let's face it, the biggest problem was in the very beginning, we didn't know anything about it. And, what do they say about the fear of the unknown? That's the biggest fear, not knowing something. I can remember, this thought just popped in my head, I can remember as a kid, they used to have these little public service announcements that they would put on after cartoons, like G.I. Joe or He-Man. And in G.I. Joe, one of the things that they would always say is they would do something like they would show some kid in the house playing with matches or something, and then they would, it'd almost catch on fire, and, one of them would come and save them, and then they would talk about why they shouldn't have done this. And the last thing they would say is, and if you're in my age bracket, or you may remember this, knowing is half the battle. And that was the statement that was made. And really, even though I was a little kid watching this, it's true. It really is. If you know something, that's half of what you got to do. Because just knowing is going to take away some of that fear. We have another word. This is only used one time, 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. And it is the idea without fear. Timidly, fearless, cowardice. It says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. Another one here, Delios. This one's used 3 times. Timid, fear. Mark 8, 26, Mark 4, Revelation 21, verse 8. All right. Anyone have any questions up to this point? We got a little bit more time, and I want to kind of delve into this just a little bit. And this is the really starting to look at some examples of individuals throughout the Bible. First one we're going to take a look at is Moses, and really how fear gripped them at different times, and really the decisions they made when they were afraid. And I think that is probably one of the best ways for us as Christians to not only understand what fear is, but to be able to use it properly, to see it in action, to see people in the Bible that went through different things. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, there is nowhere, anywhere, where I see God say, Moses, you're afraid, or Moses say, I'm afraid. But when you look at it, you see the implication. You see that Moses, it is implied that Moses is making these excuses out of fear. Now, is it, for instance, I'm not a good speaker. He gives them Aaron. Well, was he saying that because he was afraid of Pharaoh? Was he saying that because he was afraid? Remember, what was the last example he had of his own people? What happened? It made him flee. He did. Yeah. He killed an Egyptian because he was mistreating his own people, the Hebrews. And when he does this, the Hebrew people basically say, what, are you trying to make us like you? You want us to be we're going to take the blame for this murder, basically? We're going to turn you in. And he runs away. So maybe the fear was, I'm afraid to go back because they're not going to listen to me. So I'm not standing up here saying I have fear of Moses completely figured out. He's afraid, what's exactly driving that? It could be numerous things. And I think that's the really good thing about this is we can look into these things. And therefore, a lot of times when there's moments like this in the Bible, you can teach from them. To me, it's kind of like Paul's thorn in his flesh. What is Paul's thorn in his flesh? Does anyone know? We don't know what it is. It's something physical because it's in the flesh. It's obviously some type of an illness of some sort, but that doesn't mean it's an illness like a cough or something. It could be something in the muscles or whatever. But how many times have you heard preachers or teachers use that verse and say, what is it? What is your thorn? What is the thing that holds you back? What is the thing that you're looking at and saying, I can't go any further because of this? Instead of looking at it and saying, I can go as far as possible because God wants me to. So, fear oftentimes leads to excuses. Chapter 3, verse 11. Who am I? Now, really, if you think about it, I wonder, he's talking to God, so you can't really be slick when you're talking to God. But you wonder if maybe Moses is sitting there throwing these answers out and saying, that's a good answer. That's exactly what he needed to hear. Who am I? Thinking, God's now going to tell you that, you're just Moses, no big deal. You're just, you're the guy God chose. You are a big deal, not because you're superhuman and better than all the rest, but because God chose you. And obviously, God's going to choose someone. 3 and verse 13, this is another good question. Well, who are you? 4 verse 1, they'll say I'm lying. So first off, who am I? Who are you? Okay, now I know who's sending me. Well, they're just not going to believe me. Chapter 4, verse 10. I don't have the necessary talents. I'm not a leader. I remember somebody one time telling me that he would never teach a class and he would never, ever be in a leadership role such as that because he just didn't have the ability to do it. Well, some of you may know this individual. His name is Eric Zachok. And before I went to Lake Milton, he was filling in teaching the teenage class for me every time I got called to go somewhere else to preach. And you know what? It really just took a little bit of encouragement. I'll never teach went from that to, will you help me teach? Okay, yeah, I'll help you teach. We're in a jam. Can you fill in for me? You know the material. Okay, I guess so. But you know what? It was fear that led that. Same thing with me in public speaking. I would have never thought I would have done that. Fear. Fear can do so many horrible things to you. I mean, let's face it. If God is looking at you and saying, I pick you, isn't there a fair amount of, leisure that you can take by saying that if God is picking me, that obviously I can accomplish this? Now, maybe it's not I can accomplish it. With God, it will be accomplished through me. But if God is calling you and saying, I have something for you to do. Eric. Anything's possible. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the key. But I also think that maybe we can learn from some of these experiences as well. In the beginning here, is Moses letting fear control him, or is fear helping him get further in life? It's controlling him, right? We see that. He's in complete control. The fear has him. Who am I? Who are you? I don't have this ability. I don't have the talent. 4 verse 13 finally led him to express what he was really feeling. Can you just send someone else? Why? I think, obviously, you don't kill an Egyptian for your people when they're being mistreated if you don't love them. I mean, he cared about his people. He was brought up by his own mother. He knew his people. So it's not that he doesn't want to go help his people, but it's just that he doesn't have the confidence in himself. And you know what? Sometimes it takes God letting us know how confident he is in us. And I think we should really think about those types of things more often. You know what? You know, I could say, you know, Moses is pretty good example of being a human being, I think, in the experiences that we see. As far as the downfalls and the positives, and how, you know what, when you first become a Christian, you know, I've had people tell me before, I've heard other preachers say this, and you may have studied with someone who said, well, I'm just not good enough to get baptized. When we think like that, we're going to be in trouble for the rest of our lives, because nothing I can do will ever make me good enough. It's through the blood of Christ. It's through God's love and through God's grace. But we do see this, and before I bring the lesson here to a close, we're going to take a look at, next week, a few more examples from the Scriptures. The next one being, you know, Israel and Joshua and Caleb. And really, there's different motives that we could look at that as far as how fear went. Joshua and Caleb obviously weren't going to let anyone sway them. So we'll take a look at that, but we'll also get into next week. We should be hopefully coming to the end of this and getting into maybe understanding for ourselves how to deal with fear. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to have all the answers for you to get through every issue that you will ever have, but it's the starting point of where we as Christians need to start to take the right steps and be in the right direction to serve God. Because fear can be a motivator, and it can motivate us to stand still, or it can motivate us to work. And we need to make sure that as Christians, we're not holding ourselves back from serving God the way that we should. Is there anyone that has any other additional questions or comments they want to add? Okay. All right, we're going to bring the lesson to a close here. Offer the invitation. If there is anyone here that has any need, I will be up here in this pew here if anyone needs to come forward for some prayers or anything. But other than that, we'll have our invitation song. If you're here tonight and you have any need, come forward as we stand and sing this song. Days are filled with sorrow and care, hearts are lonely and dreary.